It is my great honor and pleasure to welcome Elif Shafak to Conrad Festival. Hello, Elif.
Hello.
Uh, your works are widely known, so you do not need any introduction or presentation. But out of respect to you and to your achievements, let me mention a few details, important details about you for our audience. Elif Shafak is an author of 17 books, 11 of which are novels, translated into 50 languages, including Polish. I guess we have 10 of them translated into Polish by now. She holds a PhD in political science and has taught at various universities in Turkey, the US, the UK. She is a member of many institutions and councils, including European Council on Foreign Relations, a writer awarded with many literary prizes, and a writer awarding others as a juror. She is an advocate for women's rights, LGBT rights, and freedom of speech. I am really, really glad that you accepted our invitation and agreed to be with us. Although we are in two different places, we still can share our thoughts. So once again, welcome to Conrad.
I so appreciate your words. Thank you so much.
My name is Grzegorz Jankowicz, and I serve as program director of Conrad Festival. And let me start our conversation with some recollection of one event. We met each other a few years ago in Edinburgh during literary festival organized there. I attended your event. You were in conversation with Alexander Hammond, a Bosnian and American writer. It was discussion about bilingualism in literature. And I remember one sentence, your sentence, with which I would like to start our conversation about dual nature of things and people, about living in two different worlds, because this is like the real topic of our conversation. You said that to fully express yourself, you need two languages. One is not enough. You need Turkish and English. I guess many readers would intuitively understand what you meant, but could you elaborate on it? And could you tell us how does it work in your literary practice?
Thank you so much. I really care about language a lot. So for me, it is not a tool or an instrument that I use and put aside. I think of language as a space you enter in and you inhale, you digest. I think languages shape us. And I'm always in love with languages, plural. But that said, I did not grow up in a bilingual house. So Turkish is my mother tongue, even though I was born in France. I was brought back to Turkey at a young age. So Turkish is the main language I grew up in. And the reason why I say this is because English for me is an acquired language. I am an immigrant in the English language. And my connection with the English language is perhaps more cerebral, whereas my connection with the Turkish language is a bit more emotional. And I think I'm an emotional person, like all of us. And sometimes writing in English gives me another balance. It gives me another space. And it also gives me freedom. So that's one thing I want to emphasize. The second thing is being a Turkish writer is very heavy. It's a heavy experience. The subjects that I'm dealing with are also heavy. And again, writing in another language gives me an additional freedom of speech, which I appreciate. And overall, I think I realize I feel attached to each language in a different way. If my writing has melancholy, sorrow, sadness, longing, I find these things much easier to express in Turkish. But when it comes to humor, which is very important for me, when it comes to irony, satire, I find it much easier in English. In Turkish, we don't even have a word for irony. We don't do irony, So I think from each language, you take different bits and pieces. It's not an easy experience, but we live in an age in which many of us are commuters between languages and cultures. If the mind can dream in more than one language, I think we can write fiction in more than one language.
Thank you. Joseph Conrad, who is our patron, this festival is not about him. He is only a patron for our festival, but we sometimes refer to him. He used to say that there is this blurred element of his English. English-speaking audience can notice this element, but cannot grasp it, cannot understand it. And he thought that this spot on the surface of his English was cast by Polish, his first language. Do you share similar experience while writing or while thinking, while communicating? And do these languages, Turkish and English, determine each other, determine the way the other one determining the other, to the extent that you feel that there is something belonging not to Turkish but to English, or not to English but to Turkish?
Actually, I'm so glad you mentioned Conrad, because for me, in my own literary journey, he has been incredibly important. Not only Conrad, but many thinkers, poets, novelists coming from Polish background, I somehow found it very close to my heart. And the subjects that they have been dealing with also resonate with me. I find a closeness of spirit there. So I'm very glad that we're having this conversation across borders. Poland is a country that's very, very important to me, which you might find interesting because I'm a Turkish writer, but I want you to know that many things that originate from Polish thinking resonate with a Turkish writer. That said, Conrad is especially important because of his journey, his courage, the way he delved into the English language, and he created marvels with the English language. He is no doubt one of the leading writers in that regard. And I think I understand, what he means by that blurred edge. There are things that you feel as a foreigner, as a latecomer, as an immigrant, whatever you call that experience. Sometimes I think as immigrants, our minds run faster than our tongues. The mind is just a step ahead. The tongue is trying to catch up. That gap can be very frustrating, but it can also be very inspiring, because what happens is you don't take words for granted. You have a different connection with words. Maybe you pay more attention to nuances that the natives might be taking for granted. So that experience of being an insider-outsider, that blurred edge, that threshold experience, where you are very lonely as a writer, but at the same time, you have an experience that perhaps many writers in the center don't experience that way. And that can be an additional source of richness, even though it's also no doubt a challenge.
But some writers say that we cannot transfer everything to another language, that it's impossible to translate everything. Others think that we can easily transfer everything. Everything is translatable. We just have to know both languages well enough. We need a good translator, and that's it. Where do you stand on that? Do you think that there is an element that cannot be transferred to another language and another culture, or that everything, even if you need 2 or 3 or 4 different languages to express yourself, but still something expressed can be transferred to another culture, to another reader?
We always talk about what is lost in translation, but we don't usually hear people talking about what is gained in translation, what is earned in translation. I think there's 2 sides to the story. And I don't believe in absolute translation. If we're talking about literary work, if it is a legal document that you are translating on a one-to-one basis, that's something else. But in fiction, in poetry, I don't think there's such a thing as absolute translation, Some things are lost, some things are gained, and this is part of the journey. And I believe we should be more flexible about that, as long as we don't lose the essence, the core. I'll give you examples. I know some works, some books that are not as powerful in their original language as in their translated forms. Why? Because the translators have done wonders. So I have a lot of respect for the job of translators. They are doing an amazing work. Sometimes people ask me, why don't you translate your own work into Turkish? I can't. It's a completely different zone of creativity. It's a very different talent to be able to translate from one language to another. And really, I have a lot of respect for that. And secondly, I think we learn a lot from all these journeys, commutes among languages. So rather than looking for the precise, absolute preservation, I think I've learned to be a bit more flexible, and I've learned to enjoy the commute between languages more.
You said that it's all right as soon to translate something as soon as we preserve the essence, as soon as we stick to the core. What would it be for you? What would be the essence in your stories? Experience, feelings, the rhythm of language, the combination of thoughts? How would you define this essence that we have to stick to, that we have to preserve in translation?
That's a very good question. And I think there are a couple layers, not just maybe one essence, but a couple of layers that I want to emphasize because they're important to me. Of course, the core of the story, the essence of the story, the spirit of the story should be preserved. But also the rhythm is very important for me. And that's where the challenge begins for the translator. What makes the things even more difficult is the fact that Turkish language has a very different grammatical syntax than the English language. For instance, it is relatively easier to translate a text from French into English, where they share a vocabulary, where they share words, where they have similar grammar structures. But when I'm talking about Turkish, it's the exact opposite. So the verb noun structure in Turkish is completely different than, for instance, Anglo-Saxon languages. Turkish is in that sense closer to Hungarian, to one end goes to Korean. The linguistic family that it belongs to is a different family. But there's something additional in the Turkish experience. As you know, the Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious empire. As a result, the language the vocabulary was a mixture of words coming from different ethnicities. So we had Turkish words, but we also had lots of Arabic words, Persian words, Armenian words, Ladino Jewish words, Greek words, Kurdish words. When the language was Turkified, half of the vocabulary was taken out because they were not originally Turkish. As a writer, I've always felt a lament in my soul because we lost nuances. Our vocabulary shrunk. And this has been one of the things that I've been questioning when I was writing in Turkish. When I write in Turkish, I use both old words and new words. I don't even understand who would call words old because let all the words live. Words live longer than human beings. It should be organic, open-ended. I'll give you one example. In Turkish, I can say yellow and I can say red, but the shades in between, I don't have words to describe because those words used to come from Persian and they have been taken out of the language. And to me, that is a loss. I like nuances. I like nuanced way of writing. So even when I was writing in Turkish, I was trying to expand the limits of the vocabulary, especially daily life vocabulary that has been given to us.
From what you said, it looks like you are living as a writer, as a human being, in many different languages. I can read your books only through Polish or English. I do not know Turkish, but I read a lot about your work. And authors of these essays, critical text about your novels, they point out that, for example, Ottoman Turkish language neglected after Ataturk reform, is also very important for your prose. So I am aware of it, but when reading the translation, when reading the text in Polish or in English, I cannot sense it. I cannot touch these words with my imagination. I wonder, do you have this experience with your translators, trying to recreate this richness, this complicated fabric of your language in their languages?
I have these fascinating conversations, experiences with translators into multiple languages. And over the years, as my works have been translated into new and new languages, I have been learning more and more, to be honest. But I'll give you one example. One of my earlier books in Turkish has a completely different title than the English title. And I must say, I have been, as you pointed out, writing in English primarily for the last maybe 15 years now. So I switched to writing in English primarily. So the original texts are in English, but once they're translated into Turkish, I take the translation and I rewrite it with my own rhythm, with my own vocabulary. So in a way, it's very insane what I'm doing, because I spend twice as much time, and in a way I'm working maybe twice on the same text once it has been translated. And the reason why I do this is because I love storytelling. I love languages. And the question and the example that I had in mind was one of my earlier novels in Turkish. The title was very different. This is a story that deals with an honor killing, and it questions masculinity, our notions of honor, and it tells the story of a half Kurdish, half Turkish immigrant family in London. And the English title is Honor. But the Turkish title is Iskender, which means Alexander. That's the name of the boy who,
the main character.
decides,
not main character, but one of the characters.
Yeah, true. Who decides to punish his mother for, transgressing codes of honor. Now, when my English publisher saw the Turkish title, they said, if we publish it as Alexander, people are going to think this is a book about Alexander the Great. It's a historical book, they're going to think. So let's choose the concept rather than the name of the character. And they named it Honor, which is fair enough because it's a very central concept in the book. But when my Italian publisher saw the name Honor, they said, no, we can't call it Onore or Honor, because then people are going to think it's a book about the mafia. So, and the Italians said, we want a more poetic name. And they named it The House of the Four Sons, which is the name of the village in the book. I can go on and on. That book's title changed multiple times from one country to the other. And I understood that, because with each culture, you have to be open as a writer. You need to understand that in each culture, there are different meanings attributed to same words. And I think we should be okay with that. But in addition, I can tell you, in order to understand the culture better, maybe we also need to pay attention to those words or concepts that cannot be translated easily, because there are clues there about the cores of those cultures. So for instance, in Turkish culture, the word honor is a very heavy word. I don't get that kind of heaviness in the English language. To me, all those experiences are also interesting. The same word, the same story can acquire new shades as you move from one culture to the other.
In Polish, the title of the book is Honor,
Yes.
as in English.
Yes.
So there are at least two sides of your literature, as you said. There is a Turkish side, more personal, and there is also English side. Through English, you express weakness, irony, humor, satire. But I wonder, I want to ask you about one of the most famous of your novels, which is The Bastard of Istanbul. This novel is about very severe, intense, painful experiences, deeply rooted in Turkish culture, society, and experience. Why did you choose English for for it?
I think had I written the book in Turkish, it would have been a different book. I felt more free when I was writing in English. As I mentioned at the beginning, being a Turkish novelist is a heavy experience, and I needed a bit of lightness. I needed more freedom because that book, like many of my works, deals with difficult subjects. The Bastard of Istanbul, as you know, is the story of a Turkish family and an Armenian-American family, told through the eyes of women. It's a book that deals with memory and amnesia. Turkey is a country with a very rich, long, complicated history. We have a strong, long history. That doesn't mean we have a strong memory. Just the opposite. Turkey is a country of collective amnesia. We have a very weak collective memory. We don't know our own pasts. We don't talk about it in a nuanced way. And the only way history is taught at schools is through Turkish nationalism or some kind of Islamism that always says we were a great empire, we brought justice and civilization wherever we went. That's the only thing you learn at school. It never occurs to us to ask, how would I feel if I had been a minority member in the Ottoman Empire, if I had been an Armenian craftsman, silversmith, or a Jewish miller, or a concubine in the harem? How would my life be like if I were a woman in the Ottoman Empire, if I were born in the Balkans, in the Middle East, if I was on the periphery? Then when you ask these questions, you realize the story changes. But we can't do that because in Turkey, the official narrative is very dominant and domineering. So when I wrote the book, of course, it was very difficult for some people to see it in a more open space. I met lots of ultranationalist reaction when the book came out. Why did I write it in English? I was writing in English by that time already. I had switched to writing in English. But as I said, even the word bastard is much heavier in Turkish. In English, it's a bit lighter. So writing in English gave me an additional sense of freedom, and I was able to tackle a very difficult subject in another language more freely.
I want to come back to what you said about rewriting your books in Turkish. When you do it, when you help with translation of your novels written originally in English, what is the reaction of translator and readers? How do they react to the final text published in your country? I'm not asking about all the controversies, political, juridical controversies. We will talk about it later. For now, I would like you to say a few words about the reaction of Turkish readers to those books co-translated by you from English.
I wouldn't maybe call myself a co-translator because, of course, the main work belongs to the translator. There is no doubt. She does the hard work, and the reason why I say she, because I was fortunate enough to work with the same translator over the years, and she's amazing. Omja Korugan is her name, and she knows also my own maybe sense of rhythm very well. So we've been having a very productive relationship for which I feel grateful. But once she finishes the translation, she hands it to me. And then I not only maybe try to give it my own, cadence, rhythm, but also, as I said, old words, new, in addition to new words, my own vocabulary. I like inverted sentences. So it's a matter of maybe polishing. But of course, the translator does the hard work. How do the readers react? What is very important for me is over the years, I have had a very beautiful relationship with fiction readers. And it's very interesting because in countries like Turkey, where there is no freedom of speech, if books still survive, if literature still survives, we owe it to readers. Because what a true reader does is they read a book. If they like the book, they don't put it back on the shelf. They give it to their best friend. And the best friend, if she likes the book, she gives it to her aunt. And the aunt sends it to her, neighbor. So the same copy is shared by, on average, 5 to 6 people. When people bring me books to sign, I realize they have underlined different sentences by using different colored pens, because a book is not a personal item in Turkey, and that's very beautiful. So from the readers, I really get incredibly heartwarming energy and feedback, and many of them, I think, appreciate my language and the richness of my language in Turkish. But from the cultural and political elite, I always get the opposite. So being a Turkish writer is a bit like being kissed on one cheek and being slapped on the other cheek at the same time. It's a schizophrenic, it's a dizzying experience, because you both get hatred and love at the same time.
Here we have one of the many examples of dual nature of things and people, especially when we enter the field of politics. And I would like you to enter this sphere with me now. You mentioned this preoccupation with the past and the problem with the past in Turkish society. You write extensively about events neglected, hidden, forgotten, bringing them to light, showing them to your readers, not only in Turkey, but also living in other countries. Does it change cultural climate, cultural attitude in Turkey when people read your books, when they get closer to the past you describe? Do they feel like this is the task they have to carry on later, that it's not enough to write one book, but there is also a need of some social gestures made by the readers, made by the society?
Yeah, I think a writer's job is not only to chase stories. Of course, we love stories, don't we? We love words, we love languages. But our job is not only to chase stories, but also to pay attention to silences. I am interested in silences, and I don't want silences to continue like that. I want to understand what are the subjects that we cannot talk about, where are the taboos, political taboos, cultural taboos that we find difficult to discuss openly. I think a writer's job is not to stay in the center of power or authority, but to go to the periphery, to the margins, and pay attention to the marginalized, to people who have been disempowered, forgotten, forsaken, oppressed, and silenced. So there's a part of me that wants to bring the periphery to the center. There's a part of me that wants to give more voice to people who have been silenced. There's a part of me that wants to bring memory to all those stories that have been erased and forgotten. And I think memory is a responsibility, not in order to stay in the past, but to learn from the past. If we don't learn from the past, we will carry on making the same mistakes again and again. We owe it to the victims, at least, to remember their stories. This is a responsibility. So literature can be incredibly powerful in that regard, and it can help us to build empathy. Normally, in our daily lives, we never put ourselves, I mean, when I say never, but we rarely put ourselves in the shoes of other people, because we're always in a hurry. We have our own things to do. We're all born into a certain nationality, ethnicity, class, gender, family. We have our own identity, and usually we look at life through our own window. But when you read a novel, at least for a few hours, for a few days, you become someone else. And that is very good for our soul. It's not only an intellectual experience, it's almost like a spiritual experience. And then you realize the story changes if you become someone else. A society that has lost its ability to empathize is a dangerous society. It is not a coincidence that populist demagogues kill, they destroy empathy, and they have zero capacity for empathy. So I think empathy is a very important part of this. I have readers in Turkey who come from very conservative backgrounds. Some of them come from backgrounds of Turkish nationalism, to be honest. You know, I have a very diverse readership in Turkey. And then they come to me and they say, I've read your book, and the character that I love the most is this person or that person. And I realized maybe these readers, some of these readers had lots of xenophobic views or homophobic views. But then they come and they say to me, I love this character, and the character they're talking about is gay. They're talking, the character they're talking about is maybe Christian or Jewish or atheist, you know, or agnostic, or someone from a completely different background. The fact that that reader was able to connect with this fictional character means a lot to me, because it shows that when we are reading, we're a little bit more ready to connect with the other. That is a precious experience. If we lose literature, we will lose those connections.
A lot of people living in the West think that Western cultures are sources of progressive ideas that can be used to criticize those countries out there where regressive attitude is dominant. Whenever a writer from these regressive cultures, so-called regressive cultures, writes a book about oppression, about political mechanisms that determine humans' life, such writer is welcomed in the West with open arms. I guess some readers welcome this writer because it proves only partially and fictionally, but still these readers stick to this. It proves to them that out there people suffer a lot, and here they don't, because we would never act like that. But to think about the West nowadays, to think about the West as the source of progressive ideas is a very difficult thing. It's a very difficult task because of all the problems, political problems we encounter on everyday basis. So I would like to reverse this perspective. What is there in Turkish culture that helps you grasp, that gives you this insight into the problems of the West?
I think you're very right in pointing out that there is this dualistic way of seeing the world, which is very problematic. Actually, for too long, many people in the West assumed that the world was divided into solid lands and liquid lands. So the Western world in general was assumed to be solid, safe, steady, democratic, beyond concerns about human rights, beyond concerns about democracy, freedom of speech. And it was the liquid lands that were regarded as backward, in which people should be worried about human rights and women's rights and democracy. That was their assumption. And that assumption was wrong. That assumption was also arrogant. And I think after particularly 2016, people understood more and more in the West that there is no such thing as solid lands versus liquid lands. In fact, we're all living in liquid times. As Zygmunt Bauman used to talk about, these are liquid times for all of us, wherever we might be in the world. And it's a good thing that dualistic perception is being shattered. However, there is too much identity politics in the world of publishing and literature. And we need to challenge that identity politics. It affects us writers who are coming from different parts of the world. I'll give you an example. If you happen to be a woman writer from Afghanistan, let's say, nobody expects you to produce experimental, avant-garde, sci-fi fiction. If you're an Afghan woman writer, you should be writing about the problems of Afghan women, you know, about the sad stories of Afghan women. That is the expectation. And I think we need to fight against those identity politics. We need to refuse to be pigeonholed. Maybe in one book you will write about Afghan women, but maybe it's going to be a happy book. Who knows? But the next book maybe is going to be experimental sci-fi. Why not? So for me, it's very important to push at the limits, the boundaries, and tell nuanced stories, both about the country where I come from, but also the world I live in. if I may add this, at the end of the day, I think it all comes back to identity. How do we see ourselves and how do we see each other? I see human beings as complicated creatures that have multiple belongings rather than singular identities. I do not believe in singular identities. Of course, I'm Turkish. Of course, I'm an Istanbulite. Of course, my love for Istanbul is very visible in my work. But I also feel attached to the Balkans. I feel like I have elements in my soul from the Middle East. I am a European by birth, the values that I share. Over the years, I became a Londoner, I became a British citizen, and I would like to think of myself as a citizen of humanity, as a citizen of the world. And in the UK, the previous Prime Minister, Theresa May, she was saying, if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. That is not true. If you're a citizen of nowhere, it doesn't mean you're just floating in the air without any purpose or aimlessly. It doesn't mean you don't care, just the opposite. You can care about your country, your community, your local roots. At the same time, you can care about the planet, about the earth we're living in. You can have multiple attachments at the same time. So we need to promote this kind of multiplicity in literature as well. So you can tell the stories of the world, you can tell the stories of the country you're coming from at the same time. And that is why we need to resist these singular identity boxes that we're constantly being put into.
I absolutely agree with you, but I have a doubt, and I would like to share it with you, asking my another question. This multiplicity, multicultural attitude towards reality, towards nations, was present in the West and in the East for a very long time. And somehow, at certain moments of history, it got neglected. It was pushed on the margin. It was overshadowed. What is the reason why people resign from such a fruitful tool, such a fruitful attitude towards the world? An attitude that helps with communication, an attitude that helps with being in the world, not alone, but with others. Why do we throw it away?
Yes, indeed. It's a very important question. I think we're living in a time of lots of uncertainties. And of course, with the pandemic, those uncertainties have deepened. It's a complex world, the world we're living in. And complexity can be scary. It can also be tiring. Sometimes we feel like there's so much we need to deal with. This is a very dangerous moment in history because it is the moment when demagogues enter into the picture. And the demagogue says, don't worry, I'm going to make everything simple for you. And many people follow the demagogues because we need, as human beings, we long for a sense of safety, a sense of similarity, familiarity, some solidity beneath our feet. We long for that, understandably. But it is a dangerous thing because it can be easily manipulated, exploited. And we're seeing a lot of that right now. A rise in ultranationalism, a rise in populism, a rise in authoritarianism. What authoritarianism does is to erase multiplicity. Authoritarian ideologies do not like pluralism. An authoritarian demagogue says, I represent the people, as if the people is one thing. But in fact, the people is a multiplicity. Let's talk even to a room of students and you will see there are so many different views. That's the beauty of it. That's the challenge. But authoritarianism doesn't like ambiguity or doesn't like multiplicity or pluralism. That is where we are right now in history. Also, there are lots of negative emotions that each of us, East and West, need to deal with. For instance, anxiety, almost like an existential angst. Many of us don't know, are we going to hold our jobs tomorrow? We don't know if the next generation is going to have better education or job market, We don't know how the climate is going to turn out to be. There's our planet is burning. Whichever way you look, there are massive global challenges ahead and it creates anxiety. So we need to talk about anxiety. We need to talk about anger. We need to talk about fear, confusion, bewilderment. But I find it healthier to recognize the presence of these negative emotions in our lives, share them so that we know we are not alone. If I know that you're dealing with anxiety, my anxiety is going to lessen because I will know I am not alone. So it's incredibly important that we have these global conversations at this moment and we do not follow these nationalistic, tribalistic demagogues.
Absolutely agree. But living in multicultural groups is also quite difficult sometimes. Characters you present in The Saint of Incipient Insanities have certain issues. They have certain problems with that create discomfort in them. Problems with friends, problems with families, with partners, with lovers. But they would not share it with others. They would not talk about it. They would keep it inside because they are afraid, because they are ashamed, because they do not want to hurt feelings of others. They have a double life, actually. Something happens in them on emotional level, but they do not express it. They repress it, or they keep it only for themselves, and they smile to others, showing nothing than artificial face. It's a very frequent mechanism in multicultural, not only multicultural groups. Do you think we should find a way to express this discomfort, or do you think that we should keep it for ourselves?
I think silences are not good. To be silent about our own emotions, our own struggles is not good either. And it doesn't help us, it doesn't help others. So I'd rather give voice to silences. But if I may maybe add this, I think those silences are even deeper in authoritarian regimes or in monolithic communities, because or communities that are presumed to be monolithic. In fact, no community is monolithic, right? But some are supposed to be that way, because if it's a culture of sameness, if it's an ideology of sameness that you're living in, it will be even more difficult to express your personal struggles or emotions. In a society that appreciates or understands or embraces diversity, it is easier to express your personal complexities because there's room for diversity. I come from a country that has lost its appreciation for diversity. We never appreciated diversity. And I think the cost of that has been enormous on our conscience. I believe in cosmopolitan encounters. I understand it's not easy to be multicultural, and multiculturalism is, of course, is not a fashionable word anymore. It has been chucked aside so easily by today's politicians. You will remember there was a time when multiculturalism used to be a positive word, no longer. But I want to defend the word. I want to defend diversity. At a time when we are being imposed a culture of sameness, we are being sold an illusion. They're telling us if we are surrounded by sameness, we will be safer. That's an illusion. We live in a world that is far too interconnected, so much so that a virus in one region of China affects the lives of people in Canada. So it's better if we understand the connections. We need to stop pretending as if by closing the door, building a wall, and surrounding ourselves with people who look exactly like us, we will be safer. That is not true. I think diversity, inclusion, egalitarianism, these are values that are worth defending. I also believe as human beings, if we're going to learn anything in this life, we will be learning from differences. Someone who speaks exactly like me, who dresses like me, who looks like me, is my mirror image. If I only want to see my own mirror image around me, that's a very narcissistic existence. You know, you come from a different background, I come from a different background. You're going to teach me things that have never occurred to me, and maybe I will be able to show you things that you weren't perhaps aware of. You see what I mean? So differences are important. Cultural encounters are important. If we close those doors, I don't think the world will be any safer, and I don't think the world will be any better either.
One of the sentences you expressed that we learned from diversity appears in your novel titled Honor in Polish and in English, as far as I remember. And I would like to ask you about this novel. This Toprak family lives in London, but their members stick to very traditional, very conservative, extremely conservative rules. In their value system, shame is associated with women, and only with women, paradoxically, the shame can be cleaned out. Although they claim that women do not have honor. It's really shocking for someone who does not share this system of values. One of the characters, you mentioned him, Iskender, decides to restore honor of the family. And at first we are shocked by his way of thinking, way of reasoning. We are shocked by his actions. He commits a criminal gesture. But you present this character in a very peculiar way. At the end, we understand that it's not only his guilt, but this is the guilt of the whole group, or the guilt of the whole society. It doesn't make him less guilty, but it changes our attitude towards him. Was it intentional, or is it only my interpretation of this character?
No, I so wholeheartedly agree with your interpretation, because it was intentional, in the sense that my view is, of course, it's not easy to be a woman in a patriarchal, sexist society. Turkey is a deeply patriarchal, sexist society. And I know the lives of women, especially younger women, are not easy. But I also know that it's not easy to be a man either. Especially if you're a young man who doesn't conform to given descriptions of masculinity, your life can be very difficult. You can be ridiculed, you can be ostracized, you can be shunned. So I want to talk about masculinity, which is like a straitjacket imposed on boys from a younger age onwards. And what are the struggles that those boys are going through? They can't even show their emotions because it's not allowed. The concept of honor in Turkey is so heavy, and it's so dominant. When we drink, we don't drink to health. We don't drink to love. We drink to honor. I don't like that. What does honor mean? I want to question that. So honor is also a name we give to our, to males, to boys. It has a masculine connotation. There's family honor, there's tribal honor. And all of these have detrimental, destructive effect on the lives of women and men. This is a country where gender violence is escalating. In Turkey, we have seen an alarming rise in violence against women. And I think this is an urgent issue. The increase in the percentage of gender violence in the last 10 years in Turkey has been 1,400%. I mean, every day women are being killed. Every day women are being harassed. These are urgent issues. So we need to question this notion of honor. We need to challenge it. We need to stop looking for honor in, the sexuality of women. And I think we need to do this urgently.
What would have to happen to Iskender and with Iskender to stop him from his actions?
For me, it was, I'm a feminist, and I have learned so many things from women's movements of past generations. I'm also someone who wants to broaden women's movement. I think women's movements should also bring men on board. And there are so many important conversations we need to have together. Masculinity is one of them. One of the things that I wanted to question in the book was the mother raises her son differently than her daughter. And many mothers in Turkey do this. We treat our sons like little sultans in the family. We teach our daughters to help the mother, with housework, but never the boys. And many boys grow up thinking they have a duty to keep an eye on the modesty of the women around them. This is how we raise our sons. This is wrong. So from an early age onwards, you build a masculinity and you trap these boys into that prison of masculinity that's being imposed from above. And they can't live their own lives, these boys. They can't be free either. I did a lot of research when I was writing Honor, and I also read very difficult testimonies of men who had committed similar crimes against their own mothers or sisters. There are difficult conversations we need to have, because sometimes the matriarchs in the family, like the great grandmother, also approves of the crime. These are incredibly horrific things. But for me, as someone who believes in human rights, it's important to understand the nuances in the story rather than saying men oppress women, full stop. I want to have a more nuanced approach and show there are different sides to the story, and we all need to work together against patriarchy, against sexism, against discrimination, because it's ruining all of our lives.
Amos Oz wrote this book. It was a collection of lectures he gave, how to talk to the fanatic. And I had this thought yesterday when I prepared myself for this conversation with you, that perhaps one of the mistakes we make is that we treat all the fanatics of the world as representatives of the same group. That we ignore cultural determinations that create a particular fanatic. Maybe we should not address all of them as one, but we should also remember that each fanatic from each culture, from each country, needs, so to say, special. We need to take a special perspective on it to neutralize fanaticism, because globally, I think what I observe globally, we are weaker and weaker fighting against fanaticism. Maybe because we just hit at something general. Maybe because we fight with something too abstract. What do you think?
I think I make a distinction between fanatics who are in power and people who might be looking for answers because of problems in their own lives, because of struggles in their own lives. So I make a distinction between the people and the ideologues, or those in positions of power and authority. The first group, we should be very critical of, because they're exploiting people's fears, emotions, anxieties, and they're creating enormous damage, and they're also inciting violence. So that kind of hate speech that says you can put a cross on your neighbor's house because the skin of their color is different, or their ethnic background is different, or their sexual orientation is different, so they're beneath you. That teaching has no room, in our century, and should be very openly challenged and questioned. But I hear what you're saying. At the same time, you're saying there are people who are looking for solutions, for answers. They might be voting in different ways than maybe we would personally. I cannot belittle people because they think differently or look for different solutions. We need to keep communicating. We need to keep talking. And again, we need literature for that, because one of the most important things, very simple but very fundamental things that literature teaches us, is this. If I had been born into a different family, in a different part of this country, in a different part of Europe, in a different part of the world, if I had been raised under a different roof with a different story, I would be thinking differently today. We can never forget that fact. You know, we should never be too sure of our own truths. I don't like absolutism. I don't like these clashing certainties, and I don't like the arrogance that comes from it. So always doubt your own truth as well. And never forget, I think we should never forget that I might be in their position. I might be voting, you know, I'm not a fan of Brexit. I might have voted for Brexit if I had been born in a different part of the UK. So I need to understand those stories. I cannot look down upon those stories. And I think we can do two things at the same time. Have empathy, communication, keep connecting with people of all worldviews openly with honesty, but at the same time be very critical of the demagogues, ideologues, preachers who are trying to, and political leaders who are trying to exploit the situation at this moment in time.
Your characters, they don't absolutism neither. They have these, some of them, they have these amazing feature. They can change their opinions. They are very attentive to the world. They are very attentive to other people. They can transform themselves not only to adjust to the situation, but to understand the world and others better. What is the source, in your opinion, what is the source of this plasticity of soul, plasticity of mind? How can we develop such plasticity to communicate with others in a better way?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that plasticity, that cognitive flexibility, and if I may use this word, maybe humbleness. We need to be a bit more humble, you know. I think we forgot to say, I don't know in this age. You can ask me anything you want. I have the illusion that I can answer you because I have a Google, right? So I can Google the answer. I can learn a few things about that subject and give you a bit of an answer, thinking that I know something about the subject, but in fact, I know nothing about the subject. This to me is very important. So I make a distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom. I think we're living in an age in which we're bombarded with information. We have way too much information and we cannot process it. Also, we have too much misinformation, which is making things even more complicated. But knowledge is something else. Knowledge requires to slow down. Knowledge requires books, in-depth analysis. Knowledge requires literature, but also literary conversations, cultural festivals, more nuanced approaches. And then there's wisdom, which is something completely different. I think wisdom requires emotional intelligence. And for wisdom, we need to bring the heart and the mind together. And we need stories, we need empathy for that. So one of the things that I would like to happen is to have less information, which makes us arrogant, which gives us the illusion that we know something when we don't, but to have more knowledge and ultimately, hopefully, even more wisdom. We need to change this ratio.
Thank you. We have some questions from the audience, so let me give them voice. Here is the question. You differentiate between spirituality and religion, considering yourself a spiritual person and not religious. What is this spirituality you practice every day? I assume that part of it is your literature, is writing, but what else?
It's a beautiful question. I appreciate it. I do make a distinction between religiosity and spirituality because I think in religion, collective identities are very important. This distinction between us versus them, and the hidden assumption that us is somehow better or somehow closer to truth or closer to God than them. I don't like that. That is not close to my heart at all. And I don't like certainty. And sometimes people who are very certain of their religiosity, they want to get rid of doubt. But faith without doubt is a dogma, and dogmas are very, very dangerous, and they're destructive. Maybe equally, I don't like the certainty of atheism either, because sometimes the certainty of atheism wants to get rid of faith. But I think in life we need an element of faith too. And also there are secular acts of faith. When you start writing a novel without knowing what you are doing, it's a secular act of faith. When you move to a new country without knowing what kind of a life you're going to build there, it's a secular act of faith. When you fall in love, you don't know if that person is going to make you happy, but you follow an intuition. It's a secular act of faith. So we can talk about faith in non-religious terms. And I think it's important for liberals, Democrats, progressives, however you describe, to start speaking about faith in a different way, because these are areas that we have abandoned for too long. So rather than feeling closer to the religious or to absolute atheism, I think I feel closer to agnostics, who are a little bit more confused, who like the dance of faith and doubt. I like faith and doubt to challenge each other all the time. You know, it's an interesting conversation. I like mystics who were on the edge, mystics who were misfits. You know, they were walking a very fine line between faith and doubt. So I like heterodox mystics. And this is a very minority position that I find very difficult to talk about because it's a very nuanced approach, in my opinion. But I think it's important. So spirituality for me is an individual journey. We all have our own spiritual journeys. You might start your own spiritual journey maybe as a believer. You might end it up as a non-believer. You might start it as a Jewish mystic, you might end up as a Buddhist, or vice versa. Who am I to judge you? It's your journey. All I can do is respect you, because every single journey is unique, like our fingerprints. So that kind of individuality, that kind of openness, but also humbleness, is something that I find close to my heart. And that is why I like individual spiritual journeys.
Oh, this approach, this view is very, very close to me. We have another question. It's about your grandmother who raised you. Does this experience determine your perception of the world, and what kind of cognitive filters you gained while being raised by her? She was a healer. Is there any particular memory related to her or to her patients that shaped your imagination?
Thank you. This is such a great question. I think it left a big impact on me. The fact that I did not grow up in a typical, traditional, patriarchal Turkish family, to be honest. I was raised by two women, my mother and my grandmother. I was born in France, in Strasbourg, and the first house that I was brought to was full of immigrants, leftist students, you know, talking about revolution, smoking gouloirs, cigarettes. It was a very different world, reading Jean-Paul Sartre. When my parents' marriage collapsed, my father stayed in France and he got remarried. And my mother brought me to Turkey because for her, Turkey was motherland. For me, it was a completely new country. And that experience was not an easy experience for me. After Strasbourg, we came to my maternal grandmother's house, which was in Ankara, the capital of Turkey. This was a very conservative, very patriarchal neighborhood where we were like the odd ones out. Again, I felt like the others, like we were on the edge of the society. And my mom was a young divorcee. She had made a huge mistake because she had dropped out of university in order to follow my father to France. So she thought education was not important. So when she came back as a young divorcee, she had no diploma, no career, no money, nothing to rely on. And women in such positions are immediately married off, usually to someone older. And this is what the neighbors were trying to do when my grandmother intervened. And she said, no, my daughter should go back to her education. She should have a career. I will raise my granddaughter until the day her mother is ready to, come and pick her up. So it was a very unusual upbringing I had. And I must say my grandmother was not very well educated herself because she had been denied an education because she was a girl even though she loved school. She was taken out of school and married at a younger age. So the fact that that woman supported her own daughter's independence is very important to me. She changed my mother's life and she changed my life and probably my children's as well. That's why I'm a big believer in sisterhood. When women support each other, the impact of that kind of empowerment goes beyond generations. And I think it had a big impact on me because I realized maybe she wasn't educated in the best schools with the best diplomas. She was a very wise woman. She helped me to understand the difference between knowledge and wisdom. You know, she also helped me to understand the importance of compassion. She was a compassionate person, a loving person. She wasn't judgmental. Her notion of maybe belief wasn't full of fear, you know, haram and halal and all those more fearful teachings. She had a very loving approach. And I think all of these things left an impact on me. And I think she was a storyteller. She was an oral storyteller. And there's a part of me that always appreciates oral culture, which sometimes writers look down upon in my country. Some writers do, I should say, because it's not regarded as sophisticated. That was never the case with me. I've always respected oral culture and maybe tried to bridge written culture and oral culture.
And another question, you said once that you see a lot of magic in everyday life. Because of pandemia, we got closed in our houses and apartments, got secluded from others. What happens to magic in such moments? Do you still see it even in these difficult times?
These are wonderful questions, very inspiring questions. Magic never disappears, I think, and that's the beauty of it, because it exists even under the most challenging situations. It's a matter of seeing. When I say magic, I'm not talking about, you know, miracles or anything like that, but recognizing the beauty in even seemingly small things. And this moment of coronavirus and the pandemic is very important because maybe it made us appreciate those small things even more. In the past, and I see this more and more, especially in the West, people were more focused on, you know, success and you know, the next meeting and the next meeting, this almost constant race that never stops. And many people, of course, had to, under lockdown, had to slow down, go within, and then you realize you appreciate more family, love, friendships, maybe enjoying nature. Just a small moment of quiet sitting under a tree becomes so important, that kind of freedom, being able to leave the house. Things we didn't pay attention to enough before have become more important. And there's also magic in those moments. So I think we're at a very important moment in time when we have to reform, restructure, and renew our lives. People with all the good intentions sometimes ask, when are we going to go back to the normal? I don't want to go back to the way things were before the pandemic, because that wasn't normal, you know? And we need to build a better world and a new world.
The last one is from me, not from the audience. In Black Milk, one of the characters treats reading as needlework. Yeah. How can we make such readers to change their attitudes towards literature and towards world? Yeah. I have my own answer to this question, yeah, but I want you to talk about it.
I believe it's so important that we keep reading, because reading will help us enormously in our own personal journeys. But when I say reading, reading across the board, reading fiction and nonfiction, from East and West, not reading always the same type of books, but being curious, open-minded. To be honest, sometimes I feel very sad when I hear people, and usually it's male readers who do this, they say, I read politics. I read about politics, history, I read about economy, international relations. I don't have time for fiction. You know, I want to know what's happening in the world. I read important stuff. And I feel sad because why are we dividing knowledge into these artificial categories? Fiction has everything in it. Anything that is the subject of life is the subject of fiction. So inside fiction, there is philosophy, there is politics, there is economy, there is social psychology. Everything is there in stories. But more importantly, perhaps, I don't know a single human being who doesn't need emotional intelligence. You might be a baker, you might be an engineer, you might be a dentist, you might be a designer. I don't know a single person who doesn't need empathy, who doesn't need emotional intelligence. And what fiction does is to nurture our ability for emotional intelligence, which increases our resilience in life and makes us wiser a little bit more and helps us to see the world through a different light. So I believe this is a time when we need to nurture the art of fiction, storytelling. It's a time when we're going to need books, literary conversations even more. But if I may add this, I also know that the novel, especially the novel, because it's so layered and nuanced and it helps us our cognitive flexibility, and it's an open space where you can hear diverse opinions and discuss major issues. The novel, I think, is one of our last remaining democratic spaces. If you care about democracy, I think you should care about fiction.
Very nice. My answer to the question, what can we do?
I am curious, yes.
My answer is to give them your novels, and eyes, minds, and souls will get open. I admire your works for many reasons, but one thing is extremely important for me. Whenever I read your stories, I have no doubts on which side of the conflict you stand, be it political, be it ideological or religious quarrel. But at the same time, there is no reduction, no simplicity in your stories, which gives me, you named it beautifully, the space in which I can dwell, the space in which I can think and understand better, not only myself, but especially others. So thank you for this. I would like to thank you for this conversation. And I hope to see you soon in real when the pandemia is over.
May I also thank you for such a nuanced, this beautiful literary cultural conversation. I enjoyed it enormously, and I would love to hopefully repeat the conversation or have a new one face to face one day in Poland. That would be amazing. Thank you so much.
You are welcomed, and please keep in your mind that as soon as the pandemia ends, and as soon as we will be able to organize our festival in real space, we will be pleased to have you here.
Thank you. I'll be looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.